Our next speaker is one of the most exciting political philosophers writing in Britain today, Sarah Fine. She writes from a cosmopolitan perspective. Her book, has it come out yet, Sarah? Forthcoming book is a trenchant critique of the use of borders to limit the movement of people. So very helpful in Martha's quest to emigrate to Finland.
So it's a fantastic honour to be here in the presence of one of the world's greatest philosophers from whom we've all learned so much over the years. And when John asked me to take part in a workshop on Professor Nussbaum's latest book, Political Emotions, of course I said yes right away. Next time I'll know to check out the length of the book before I jump in. Fortunately for me, though, Political Emotions is incredibly readable, and unusually for a contemporary philosophy text, it's actually even a page-turner, as George said. It's full of stories, speeches, poetry, talk of music and drama from ancient Greece to modern India. But of course, that's all part of Professor Nussbaum's underlying message and project in the book. That dry, abstract ideas and principles alone, shorn of their context, their history, their emotional appeal, their rhetorical force, may not be, often are not, sufficient to inspire, motivate, and move us to act. And particularly not in ways which require us to compromise and make personal sacrifices for others. Professor Nussbaum's argument in defense of a form of political liberalism, as we've heard, has many parallels with that of the great American philosopher John Rawls. Nussbaum writes that her project lies close to and complements his. But whereas Rawls's writings can be dense and forbidding, Nussbaum's book is warm and inviting. As she quips, had Martin Luther King Jr. written in the manner of Rawls, world history would have been very different. Moreover, this book is intended as political philosophy for the real, imperfect world. The project, she explains, is about real ideals and real striving. It's motivated, she says, by the difficulty of attaining and stabilizing lofty goals, but it understands those goals as parts of real-life human politics. The emotions on which it draws, she says, are real human emotions, and its psychology is a non-ideal and realistic human psychology. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the arguments about patriotism in Professor Nussbaum's book. And so I'm going to have to start with the obvious point. No doubt many people here are familiar with Professor Nussbaum's views on patriotism as expressed in her famous essay, Patriotism and Cosmopolitanism, which was first published in 1994 and then in the book For Love of Country, Debating the Limits of Patriotism in 1996. In that essay, Professor Nussbaum warns of the moral hazards of encouraging patriotic love. I believe, she writes, that this emphasis on patriotic pride is both morally dangerous and subversive of some of the worthy goals patriotism sets out to serve. For example, the goal of national unity in devotion to worthy moral ideals of justice and equality. These goals, she continues, would be better served by an ideal that is more adequate to our situation in the contemporary world, namely the very old ideal of the cosmopolitan, the person whose allegiance is to the worldwide community of human beings. In that essay, she argues in favour of a cosmopolitan education. World citizenship, rather than national citizenship, should be the focus for civic education. Therefore, it might be something of a surprise to find that in Political Emotions, Professor Nussbaum is arguing in favour of patriotism of a particular kind, and in favour of patriotic education of a particular kind. The move away from deep anxiety about patriotism, especially in education, and towards defending the fostering of patriotism, especially via education, may appear at first to be a U-turn and to signal a complete change of heart. But actually, that's not what we have here. I'd say it's more of a change of emphasis. For Nussbaum remains committed to the same fundamental goals and values: the maintenance of decent societies, the pursuit of justice for all, the championing of universal aspirations and concerns. She has changed her mind, though, about the best, the most appropriate path towards pursuing these goals, and supporting these values. And in what follows, I'm going to give a brief introduction to Nussbaum's argument about patriotism in this book. And next I'll note the objections towards this approach that she herself preempts and considers in the text. And then I'll go on to ask some different questions about Nussbaum's approach as an invitation to further discussion this afternoon. Now, as you've heard already today, Nussbaum argues that all political principles need emotional support to ensure their stability over time, and that all decent societies need to guard against division and hierarchy by cultivating appropriate sentiments of sympathy and love. Humans have to be inspired, motivated to live in accordance with such principles, especially where some self-sacrifice is required. Obviously, we need the right sort of institutions, including laws too. As she notes, compassion can't run a fair tax system. But she adds that it isn't sufficient to create good institutions and then run away and hide. She says we have to get our hands dirty by entering the feared emotional terrain. She details the different ways in which well-known thinkers and practitioners of the distant and more recent past have approached these issues of motivation and stability. And as we've heard, she discusses the tradition of defending a civil religion or religion of humanity as a means of fostering the relevant commitments and behaviours. And as we know, she favours the approach of Mill and Tagore over those of Rousseau and Comte. For while all of them appreciate the need to engender common sympathies in republics, the latter promote solidarity by enforcing homogeneity and conformity, whereas the former embrace, she thinks, human heterogeneity and freedom. Nussbaum seems to agree that public culture needs something religion-like, as she puts it, but she endorses the kind of liberal public culture which leaves space for individuality, difference, experimentation, and dissent. A key player in this story, and in Nussbaum's own story, particularly with respect to her revised approach to patriotism, is Giuseppe Mazzini. He was a leading, enormously influential 19th century thinker and central figure in the Italian unification movement. He's well known as a defender of national self-determination, but he was also, importantly, an internationalist. Crucially, he defended national sympathies not as an end, but as a stepping stone towards sympathies for all human beings. He thought that the nation in his time would be the preliminary site of democratic activity and democratic institutions. And he hoped that in a world of democratic nation states, the future could be a peaceful and cooperative one. He argued in favour of a democratic, inclusive civic education, and as Nussbaum presents his argument, unmediated cosmopolitan sympathy for all human beings, the brotherhood of all, love for all, is an unrealistic goal, so immersed are people in egoistic projects and local loyalties. The democratic nation is a necessary intermediary between the ego and the whole of humanity. By building the right sort of patriotism, then, people concerned with universal love may hope to produce the basis for a truly international fraternity. And Nussbaum believes that Mazzini basically had it right. There are many echoes of Mazzini's position in Nussbaum's argument. For example, here is a key passage. The societies that I shall consider throughout this project are nations with a variety of aspirations and goals. To that extent, the moral salience of national sovereignty is built into the conception from the beginning. Such a commitment has considerable importance for political emotions, since many familiar political emotions take the nation-state as their focus and involve commitments to its defense and flourishing. At the same time, she says, nations have aspirations, and these aspirations include commitments to the transnational realm. Our nations are aware that they are members of an interconnected world, many of whose problems cannot be solved without cooperation. Among their most urgent goals will be world peace, and they will seek fair terms of cooperation among nations in pursuing that aim. Citizens will understand that the living standard and life opportunities for people in other nations are also a matter of concern. Thus, sacrifice and sympathy do not stop at national borders. As Mazzini urged, she says, the nation is a fulcrum of the creation of universal human concern. Nussbaum defends the cultivation of a form of patriotism which inspires commitment to worthwhile ends. Patriotism, for Nussbaum, is simply love of the nation, a love that includes the feeling that the nation is one's own. In loving the nation, she says, people can, if all goes well, embrace general political principles, but in a motivationally efficacious way. The public love we need, she argues, includes love of the nation. A love that conceives of the nation not just as a set of abstract principles, but as a particular entity with a specific history, specific physical features, and specific aspirations that inspire devotion. So then the big question is how to cultivate the right kind of sympathies. And as Nussbaum explains, education will be pivotal. For instance, she says, when children hear stories of heroes of the past, they'll be urged to love and emulate people who are daring and iconoclastic, who saw a great evil and risked their own society for their own safety for the sake of justice. So you already know, of course, that the heroes of the piece include Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi and Nehru, so admired for their determination to resist injustice through unity and solidarity rather than anger and hatred. Indeed, Nussbaum draws and focuses on examples from the United States and India throughout the book, and I'll discuss that more in a minute. Public emotions, she thinks, are also fostered and shaped via the rhetoric and also the example of political leaders. She writes of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and Second Inaugural Address, of King's I Have a Dream speech, of Washington's, Gandhi's and Nehru's humility and desire to eschew hierarchy, shown clearly through their conduct and their dress. It's also generated and enhanced by public rituals, ceremonies, monuments, memorials. We've heard the US Vietnam War Memorial features heavily. In songs, including anthems, but also popular music, poetry, novels, and so forth. And because I've been working on this recently, I have to admit I have been wandering around humming lots of British patriotic songs, much to my embarrassment. The appropriate means for the cultivation of public sympathies and emotions will vary according to the context. She says we need to move real people, and what suits the Indian case may not suit the US case, as she highlights, good public emotions do embody general principles, but they clothe them in the garb of concrete narrative history. But all this requires caution. Things can go wrong. Patriotism, she warns, echoing Jürgen Habermas's words about nationalism, is Janus-faced. It looks outward, but it also looks inward. It can bring people together, but it can also encourage exclusion. And here are some of the potential problems that Nussbaum herself notes. First, the wrong kind of patriotism can be, as we know, exclusionary, targeting and excluding ethnic and religious minorities and women, for example, or encouraging xenophobia and so forth. Two, the wrong kind of patriotism can place unreasonable burdens on minorities, coercing them to conform against their will. And three, the wrong kind of patriotism can place, she says, excessive emphasis on solidarity and homogeneity, undermining diversity and individuality. So she argues, and I quote, that we must be extremely vigilant about the values we encourage people to love and pursue, and we must encourage continued vigilance by the cultivation of a critical public culture, the teaching of history in a critical mode, the teaching of critical thinking and ethical reasoning. We need to defend individual freedom, the importance of dissent, celebrating freedom of speech and conscience, and we need to teach a critical yet loving patriotism. And just as important as the teaching of patriotism are the institutional safeguards. For instance, Nussbaum emphasizes the need for constitutional rights protecting all citizens, which is especially important in defense of minorities, and also an independent judiciary. She also emphasizes the importance of the protection of the rights of immigrants. Patriotism, she says, always risks veering into xenophobia, and xenophobia often takes new immigrant groups as its targets. And she reiterates the centrality to this story of freedoms of speech and the press. So that's a brief guide to Nussbaum's defense of a critical, freedom-enhancing patriotism as she sees it, including how to keep it on the straight and narrow, as it were, and avoid it veering off in the wrong direction with institutional checks and the right kind of critical education. And rather than restate any of the objections that Nussbaum preempts and examines, then, not that I think that she's answered all those objections, but I think she's already obviously thinking about them, I'm going to outline a different set of questions that arose for me as I read the book and that can set the scene for our forthcoming discussion. And the first question relates to the challenges of applying these arguments about this form of love of the nation outside the US and Indian contexts. As Nussbaum explains, she doesn't want to try to deliver a general philosophical theory of the construction of political emotions, both because she doesn't want to be too prescriptive, she wants to leave room, as she says, for improvisation, critical independence, and quirky individuality, and because she emphasizes that any such project must be contextual. But we might wonder how well these ideas travel. The US and the Indian contexts, while dramatically different in many important respects, do also share some important similarities, particularly apparent in the examples on which Nussbaum draws. Note that these are both countries which fought against the imposition of foreign rule, set themselves up as free republics, casting off the tyranny of a foreign monarchy, a common enemy, fostering new nations under new leadership and laws, starting over. Emphasizing the speeches, behavior, examples of Washington, Lincoln, King, Gandhi, and Nehru, Nussbaum is emphasizing moments of founding and refounding, of birth and rebirth, of forging unity in times of crisis, and so forth. And these seem to be moments highly conducive to a particular kind of critical reflection, to championing the causes of liberty and equality, calling for solidarity and unity, generating great public emotion, sympathy, and fellow feeling. And these moments, so pivotal in the history of both these countries, and so fresh in the minds of the citizens, continually memorialized as they are, remain a potential source of public emotion now. Now, Nussbaum notes in passing that it's difficult to address the topic of patriotic emotion in Germany, for instance. But how well might these ideals translate, say, to the British context, which presents an altogether different picture, past and present? We still have a constitutional hereditary monarchy in possession of palaces and castles, acres of vast land and vast wealth, and just as importantly, huge public support. Our national anthem, sung loud and proud at sporting events of all kinds of national celebrations, is as follows, for those of you who don't know it. God save our gracious Queen. Only if other people, are people going to sing it with me? Come on, who's British in the crowd? Let's go. God save our gracious Queen. I'll say the rest, no one else is singing it with me. Long live our noble Queen. God save the Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the Queen. We are her loyal subjects. In 2012, we had a public holiday to celebrate the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. Her face adorns our stamps and our currency. What's more, we still have two established national churches, the Church of England and the Church of Scotland, and the Queen is defender of the faith. Our public culture is dominated by one religion, not just something religion-like. In 2002, when the BBC conducted a poll of 30,000 people to develop a list of the 100 greatest Britons by popular vote, in the top 10 came Princess Diana and Queen Elizabeth I. This is a country that still celebrates landed gentry and their stately homes. This is a country which obviously has a long imperial history, and the Queen remains the head of a commonwealth, the 53 countries of which were most of which were under British rule. And many Britons continue to believe that the British Empire, despite some injustices here and there, all in all was a jolly good thing, and regret Britain's decline on the world stage in post-imperial times. Britain's imperial past is still celebrated in some of our most well-known patriotic songs I've been singing recently, such as Rule Britannia, Britannia Rule the Waves. This seems very far from a country on the verge of publicly, jointly facing up to the wrongs of empire and colonialism. This is a country in some places, like Northern Ireland, still deeply divided between Catholics and Protestants. And that's the reality, and it's a very strong, seemingly enduring element of the British story and of British political culture. Of course, we can tell a progressive British story of rebels and dissidents, activists, lovers of justice and freedom, featuring Chartists, abolitionists, reformers and radicals, the suffragettes, labour movement, poets, philosophers, playwrights, and so on. We can and we do celebrate the National Health Service and the welfare state. But we can't say that the progressive story about Britain's past or present is the dominant one, or one that unites a nation. We can try to push and promote that story, but it competes with others, more popular in many quarters. These stories might be malleable and constantly created and recreated, but some parts of them are quite robust. And what's more, Britain is a multinational state, and the members of one of those nations soon may opt to leave the Union. We're divided by nationality, by class, by region, between urban and rural. And any attempt to forge a national story by political leaders is usually greeted with jeers. Successive politicians try to tell us what it means to be British and English. Who can forget supporting the cricket team? Warm beer and dog lovers, according to John Major. Or is it queuing, fair play, or perhaps even Parliament? But these stories rarely go down well, and certainly not in all corners of the realm. So this is a context in which it's difficult to foster love of the nation, as Nussbaum puts it, because it's difficult to know what the nation means here. And while we're on the subject of nation, Nussbaum does not give much detail about this entity that's supposed to be the focus of patriotic love. First, why nation rather than country? In a footnote, Nussbaum explains that she's using the term nation interchangeably with nation-state or state. But that sounds a bit strange to me because these words aren't interchangeable, especially given the significant number of multinational states like Britain, Canada, Spain, Belgium, for example, and also nations without states. When she describes nations in more detail, it seems she really is talking of nations rather than states. She depicts, as she said, the nation as a narrative construct and approves of Ernst Renan's characterization of the nation as not simply a physical location, but also an idea, a spiritual principle. To define a nation, she says, is to select from all the unordered material of the past and present a storyline that emphasizes some things and omits others, all in the service of pointing to what the future may hold if people dedicate themselves sufficiently. But who gets to construct this story in real countries with existing competing narratives and in real political circumstances, characterized, something that's often left out of political philosophy, by adversarial political parties with differing agendas, differing conceptions of the national story, and crucially, differing conceptions of the national future? Nussbaum briefly mentions the territorial, geographical aspect of nations and alludes to land and place here and there. You mentioned the Martin Luther King speech where he talks about different parts of America. However, again, in the real world, territory, place, land, and borders are absolutely key aspects of national stories. And again, just as importantly, these are the key sites of conquest, contestation, conflict, and even crisis in many cases. Consider Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Britain, Canada, Australia, and so on and so on. How should real states, aspiring to justice, as Nussbaum puts it, negotiate the challenges of patriotism, of love of the nation, in these real-world conditions? The second question I have relates to the empirical claim or claims. Nussbaum agrees with Mazzini that patriotic emotion can be a necessary prop for valuable projects involving sacrifice for others, and that national sentiment is a valuable, even necessary, fulcrum on which one could ultimately leverage generous sentiments extending to all humanity. Now, it doesn't seem as though a strong sense of patriotism, even of the critical, progressive kind supported by Nussbaum, is in any way sufficient at the national level to foster widespread support for valuable national projects involving sacrifice for others. And of course, Nussbaum doesn't argue that it is sufficient. It's a cliche now, but the US case is often considered instructive here, since it's a country that ordinarily comes very high in patriotism rankings, but very low in support for welfare programs, national healthcare, and progressive taxation. Moreover, in Britain, one of the core national institutions that inspires near universal waves of love and support is, of course, the National Health Service. It was one of the centrepieces of the celebration of Britishness that was the opening ceremony of the 2012 London Olympics. But that near unanimous support, even love, hasn't been enough to shield the NHS from the privatising tendencies of the Conservative-led government. Real democratic politics, in short, is also party politics. There isn't only one game in town. The Conservative Party and the Labour Party here both claim to stand for justice, freedom, to be seeking the prosperity of the country and to be working in the best interests of everyone. But they have very different ideas about how to promote those values and ends. What of the claim that patriotism might be necessary to engender that kind of support at national level? Well, that seems a very strong claim. Perhaps these kinds of projects do require some kinds of support, perhaps some kind of sense of solidarity or common identity or belonging or attachment, or another motivating force, like the sense that these things are actually bound up with individual interests, or perhaps a commitment to fairness, or even a belief that these are the right things to do. But why must this motivating force be love of the nation specifically? What's the evidence for that? And what about the evidence in support of the claim that cultivating patriotic emotions may be a useful step on the ladder towards generous sentiments extending to all humanity? Does patriotism perform that function? And via what process exactly? Professor Nussbaum doesn't talk much about that in the book, but it seems to be a very important question. And we appear to have examples of where patriotism pushes in the other direction. If we really do think that nationwide emotions are a stepping stone to broader sympathies abroad, beyond, why not think of regional or other more local attachments as stepping stones to national ones? But in reality, regional attachments often don't promote wider national ones. And national ones often don't promote wider transnational ones, do they? Look at Britain and the European Union. A third question is about where Nussbaum's argument fits within the landscape of contemporary debates about nationalism and patriotism. It might sound as though this argument has something in common with the constitutional patriotism defended by Jürgen Habermas, among others. But Nussbaum spends just a few paragraphs discussing and criticising Habermas's approach. His vision, she says, is so moralised and abstract that one can't have any confidence that it would work at all in real life. She thinks there's too much emphasis on impartiality and not enough attention to the emotions. But note, as Jan Werner Müller has emphasised, in response to this common charge that constitutional patriotism suffers a lack of motivating power, that constitutional patriots don't just argue that people will be committed to universal abstract values devoid of context. Norms and values, says Müller, are appropriated, contested, and reappropriated against the background of particular historical experiences, specific cultural reference points, and narratives that situate the constitutional experience within wider horizons of meaning. And that sounds a lot like parts of Nussbaum's project. On the other hand, what of liberal nationalism? If constitutional patriotism is too dry to motivate, in her view, why not lean towards a brand of liberal nationalism, like John Stuart Mill, Isaiah Berlin, David Miller, Yael Tamir, and arguably, in some respects, John Rawls himself? Recall Rawls's line in The Law of Peoples, where he states that the law of peoples starts with the need for common sympathies, and he cites Mill and Tamir's work approvingly. Indeed, at one point, Nussbaum also references David Miller's On Nationality approvingly when writing, echoing Aristotle, of the need to get people to love something that's all their own and preferably the only one they have. And liberal nationalists famously champion the need for a strong sense of solidarity, in their case, fostered by a common nationality, in support of progressive goals and commitments. Now, one of the things that seems to distinguish Nussbaum's brand of patriotism from the liberal nationalism of, say, Miller and Tamir is that the latter is bound up with an account of the associative duties that accompany membership in national communities. For liberal nationalists, these special duties are integral to the relationships, the particular kinds of special attachments between co-nationals. They're not owed to non-members, and they're part of the very definition of shared nationality. Nussbaum doesn't speak in those sorts of terms in this book. She focuses on the benefits of fostering the right kinds of patriotic emotions rather than on the duties people have just in virtue of being members of the same national group. So perhaps that's where she and liberal nationalists differ most substantially. Perhaps we'll hear more about that in the questions. However, this leads on to my fourth and final question, which is about instrumentality and also, again, about real democratic politics. Almost all the way through the book, I read Nussbaum as presenting what's primarily an account of patriotism's instrumental value. It's valuable insofar as it's the means to good ends, such as support of worthy goals. The major argument in the book is that we need to cultivate the right kinds of emotions to support the right kinds of goals, commitments, values. And patriotism is an emotion that can have the right kinds of effects. Our nations, she writes, are committed to developing political emotions that support their cherished goals. She follows, after all, in the footsteps of Mazzini, for whom the nation was not an end in itself. And she lays out her argument in part 3 of the book thus: 1, aspiring societies have strong reasons to seek stability and efficacy for their good political principles. 2, if love and compassion can be appropriately extended in the spirit of Cherubino from Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro, this will strengthen the stability of decent aspiring societies. 3, love and compassion can indeed be appropriately extended by strategies A, B, and C. And 4, decent aspiring societies have strong reasons to pursue strategies A, B, and C. And that seems to me to be an argument in defense of patriotism's instrumental value. But this, I think, if that's right, puts the defender of patriotism in a strange position. The idea seems to be that the people should be encouraged to love the nation because that will have good effects. Political leaders, public intellectuals, we, she says, must be vigilant about the values we encourage people to love and pursue. But this is now in danger of sounding patrician, anti-democratic or undemocratic, of drawing a line between us who fashion, between a we who fashion the right story and a them who are supposed to imbibe it and be inspired by it. It's as though we remain above the throng, separated from the dangers of exclusionary populism, supervising, stage managing, and this is a worry to me. Nussbaum writes approvingly of Washington's cultivating a certain kind of modest dress, carefully choosing the symbols he wore to send both a message of strength and command, but balanced by gestures of a more egalitarian sort. Yet this is just an image. Ultimately, he was a leader with powers and privileges that ordinary people didn't possess. Even where the ends are worthy, and even though Nussbaum emphasizes the importance of critical thinking, there still seems to be an element of patriotism as manufactured by some for the consumption of others. But then, however, as Nussbaum mentioned at the beginning today, towards the end of the book, she concludes with a section entitled Intrinsic and Instrumental, and the argument here puzzled me a bit because it suggested that Nussbaum wasn't simply emphasizing the instrumental value of patriotism. She asks, regarding public emotions, do we want something that's simply very useful, like a Swiss Army knife? Or is it something with its own distinctive value and beauty without which our public lives would be incomplete? And her point is that the importance of political emotion wouldn't disappear with the realization of our treasured commitments and values. We need love in our lives. As she explains, so often people are not satisfied at all with their nation as it is, and yet they are bound to it deep in their hearts. That's the sort of love this book has tried to describe, embracing imperfection while striving for justice. So we're not just being encouraged to love a nation or a vision of a nation because of the worthy goals that love supports, but rather this is a story of people loving a country with flaws and faults. She says, it gets under one's skin, is undeterred by perfection. So it's a tale of real love, warts and all. But how can it be a story about the love people actually have if that is a patriotic love for, say, monarchies and established churches and memories of imperial glory and grandeur? How does that fit with the political liberal project that is at the heart of the argument? How far from Republican and democratic principles can the dominant public culture deviate before it's no longer the rightful object of our patriotic love and before it's no longer motivationally efficacious with respect to these liberal goals? In short, is this really a story of the love actual people actually have, warts and all, empires and monarchs, lands and church? Or is it the kind of love people ought to have for the right kinds of ideals and the right kinds of projects? Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was really great. It really is very challenging and hard to answer all the many points you raised. I'm very glad you mentioned that early essay, which every time I get asked to reprint it, I have to say, for my current views on patriotism, please see X. And you know, it's important that I would not describe myself as a cosmopolitan, both because I do ascribe moral significance to the nation state as what I think Grotius rightly stressed, the largest unit we know that's accountable to people and that realizes their visions, so it has that moral importance. But I'm also not a cosmopolitan because I don't think that view could be the object of an overlapping consensus. Cosmopolitanism, as I define it in that early essay, asks us to put universal humanity ahead of any other commitment, and I don't think it's plausible that among the different religions in the world, and et cetera, we could get in a given nation an overlapping consensus about that view. But I think we could get an overlapping consensus on the weaker view that at least a threshold level of the 10 central capabilities should belong to everyone. So that's the view that I think could be the object of an overlapping consensus. But anyway, let me try to answer your three challenges. Now, of course, the US and India had an advantage that they were beginning something and they didn't have to think too hard about what to take away, what to remove. It's much harder to reject and remove than it is to create. And of course, they still did have a lot of selectivity of the materials from the past, but they had a much freer narrative canvas to paint on. I think that actually South Africa is, in many ways, a more revealing case of a difficult transition to a new and essentially new nation that did, in a way, have to leave certain things behind. But what do you do with the old national anthem is one of the questions they faced. Do you just junk it? And that's what the ANC basically wanted to do. But Mandela thought that for reasons having to do with inclusion and constructive cooperation, we should instead staple it together with Nkosi Sikelel Africa and make the whole thing a kind of trilingual unity. And so anyway, these many decisions of that same sort have to be made. I would be really irresponsible if I tried to talk about Britain, and we'd first have to ask whether Britain, in your view, is even got the basic constitutional structure right, and so is it one of the ones to which my project is correctly addressed? test, and if it is, and the problem is with implementation and further fulfillment of those ideals, then we would have the question that my book does address, but I don't really know how to fulfill it. Just a word about nation. I guess I do mean nation state, and what I meant to distinguish it from was Rawls's idea of a people, which involves ethnic solidarity, and I don't want to focus on that at all for obvious reasons. I guess a multinational state, so then the question would be, what's the basic structure of Britain? Because it really, for me, nation state means basic structure in Rawls's sense, the whole bunch of institutions that governs people's life chances pervasively and from the very start. And I guess I would have thought there's probably one nation in that sense, although there might be multiple units within it that have a sort of quasi-autonomous status, but I don't know. I'll let you answer that one. So what to do with the different narratives in Britain where really what's at stake is what George talked about, contending narratives of justice. So that's why it's a puzzle for me, because I'm dealing with cases where we know what the basic constitutional principles are, then we have debates at the level of further realization and implementation. I don't know if Britain, in your view, is at that stage, or whether the competing narratives that the different parties have that leads them to configure the narrative differently are so different that they embody essentially different conceptions of justice. So that's what I would wonder. And then once we figure out what is the conception of justice at issue here and how do we want to advance it, I guess I would think there are many ways we could do that. I mean, one way not to do it, I think, is the way the new citizenship test does it, which is to put new arrivants, new immigrants on notice that they have to know all sorts of completely useless information in great detail about trivia, such as the height of the London Eye, or they can't join the nation. And, and the one Muslim that's mentioned in the test is the founder of the so-called first curry house, and you have to know all his dates, like when he arrived in Britain, when he founded this curry house, and so on. So you're really told that Muslims are basically in the food business and they're not really your fellow citizens. Another thing you have to learn is what percentage of people of a certain national origin have a certain occupation in Britain. And once again, there's a kind of stereotyping built into the test that seems to me very adverse to the project of creating equal respect among citizens. So that would be a way not to do it, but how to do it, I let you figure that one out. Liberal nationalism. I think, what you say about Mueller, I'll have to read it. I mean, that certainly gives a story about Habermas that takes it into a close relationship to what I have to say. I've been told by my German friends that what I really need to do is study Hegel, which I have to confess I have never in my life done, and I'm told that it's not the Kantian tradition, but rather the Hegelian tradition that would be of help to me, but I'm not sure. As to David Miller, I didn't face the question whether there are special duties, but I think I would probably say yes, there are. Certainly, I think we have special duties as members of families and close relationships. So in the book, I wasn't focusing on that question whether we have special duties as members of nations, but I think the duty to defend the nation, the duty to pay a heavy tax rate for the sake of supporting a social safety net. Sure, we do have special duties. I think David Miller's liberal nationalism is more liberal than Yuli Tamir's, but I haven't read her book for a number of years. I remember thinking when I did study it that there was a lot of it I didn't agree with, and that I thought a lot was a certain kind of special pleading for the government that she was then a part of, but maybe I was not being fair to her arguments, so I will not comment on that. But yeah, I think I'm pretty close now to a lot of the liberal nationalists, just simply because I came to realize that it's a very important part of making justice really work. But now, do I think that patriotism is necessary? Well, of course, it's part of a lot of strategies I discuss in the book. So there's just one chapter about love of the nation, but it's a part of a lot of different kinds of loves. And as a group, they have to serve this basic function of ensuring the stability of the political culture. And I may well have said that patriotism is a crucial part, because I do think if you have a patriotism that's misconceived or that goes astray, that would probably infect and render not so useful the other parts. But I think it's important that it's only a part, and that there's a lot that you would not, you wouldn't rely on patriotism for a lot of the kind of fellow feeling that you want to engender among citizens. You would rely on the tragic, the comic, and so on, which have your fellow citizens as their objects, not the nation as such. I also think it's very important that it's patriotism rightly conceived. So, of course, it's very difficult then to get empirical evidence. I think it would be impossible to control for all the things you need to control for, and all I could do in the book was to offer persuasive examples of how we might imagine counterfactuals. Let's say if King had not been able to reconfigure the ideal of the nation in a particularly emotionally powerful way, I think we could all see at that time in America that history would have been different, because there were other agents on the scene who were doing something quite different with the Black Power movement and so on. Again, I mean, Gandhi's critical role in turning India in a certain direction rather than a different direction. So I gave these persuasive examples, big ones, but also small ones, like my own example of my own childhood, where it was the dramatic and emotionally compelling example of Sybil Ludington, who risked her life for American freedom in this book, Ride for Freedom, which I acted out, and I made my parents act it out too. I was always making them put on plays and so on. You know, and it made me think of the principles of freedom and self-government in a rich and compelling way, which I think in the absence of that story or stories like that, I would not have done. So I can give you examples and counterfactuals, but I think a real empirical study of the kind you want would be very difficult. I mean, once again, many examples from South Africa could be given. Do I think that it's instrumental or intrinsic? What I say there is, up till that point, quite late in the book, I've been talking about the instrumental value, not just of patriotism, but of all the emotions for the stability of political institutions. But what do I really think about the intrinsic value? And I say, I myself think that it's part of an ideal of the citizen without which our nation would be less rich. And I turn at this point to Iris Murdoch, who emphasized that so you could have perfect conformity to virtue on the outside, but there's still the question, what's going on in the inner realm? And that does have moral relevance. And I think I do agree with Murdoch strongly about that point, and I think it does have political implications for an ideal of the citizen, that we really do want somebody who's not just going through the motions like and then I also turn to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but who really has it in their hearts. But I say, you know, that's my own view, and I think there's good philosophical defense for it, but I don't think I need it for the core argument in the book. So that's why I say it's more speculative, and I think it remains that, but I am in favor of it. As to we and them, what did I mean by that? I just meant we who write philosophy. I mean, that's all I meant, just, you know, and I think as a writer of philosophy, I'm not a citizen of all the countries I'm writing about, so I can't enact it. I mean, I happen to be a citizen of the US, but I'm a particularly impotent one because the positions I favor are not even on the political map at all. So, you know, as far as India goes, I think it's a different question. The positions I favor are at least on the losing side of some real political struggle. But, of course, I'm not a citizen, so I have no right to tell Indian citizens in any detail what to do. So I just meant, I do think it's legitimate to write things in the global public realm that make recommendations, that offer persuasive arguments. And then, if people are ever going to make them real in their lives, it's the people in each country who will have to do that. So that's what by we, I just meant, you know, those of us who theorize and don't have any power at all, except we just try to persuade somebody. But anyhow, let me just thank you very much for that. I haven't answered everything you raised, but at least I tried. Yep.
Sarah, do you want to?
No, I don't think I'm
Amir had a comment she wanted to raise. So,
Yeah, so my question, I was actually thinking before you brought it up of this passage where you talk about your early engagement with Sybil Luddington, and this character, this young, wild, subversive girl. And this is a story, of course, of the American founding.
Yeah.
And what I was going to ask is, what form do you think this sort of good, critical patriotism takes in a nation whose founding involved some kind of act of violence?
Well, I'm not against violence. I'm against anger, but I'm not against violence. I think the Revolutionary War was a just war.
I'm at the violence done against the Native Americans.
Oh,
sorry.
Well, I think that that isn't part of the story of Sybil Luddington one way or the other, so far as I can see. I have no reason to think that she herself was involved in any kind of violence against the Native Americans, but I do insist, and I've written quite a lot about Roger Williams's defense of the property rights of the Narragansett Indians, and I do think that any good story of the narrative of America ought to make him a hero and ought to de-heroize the people who are on the other side in that. He actually went all the way to Britain to get from Charles II a deed that guaranteed the property rights of the Narragansett Indians. He spoke their language. He lived with them for about 5 years. He was recognized as a public debater in their language. And he wrote this wonderful book about the customs of the Native Americans where he tells you how to talk to the Native Americans. And what's so interesting is it poses as a language text, but it tells you what you had better say. Things like, tell me about yourself. How are you? Come into my house. You know. So in my book on religious intolerance, I say that text is a model for how we ought to interact with people who are different from ourselves. And yeah, I mean, I think, of course, the history of America has been greatly rewritten for the better in emphasizing that narrative, and I didn't get that in my own grade school. I think that's quite fair to say. And so in that sense, I criticize my own education, but I think in other respects it wasn't so bad because it stressed the creative agency of women. That's why I put in that example. And that was I read that in about 1953, right? So that's pretty early to read about the independence and creative agency of women. And even to this day, they have this Sybil Luddington marathon where women are running. I never have run in that particular half marathon because it's just, I'm too far away from there, and it's in Connecticut, and it's a very hilly course, which I don't like. But anyway, I think it has some good aspects, but of course, teaching history today, you would talk about other things, as you say.
Okay, there's a question here from Casper.
How do I speak into this thing? Can anybody hear me? Yeah. Hi, I'm Casper Bachera. I'm here at UCL undergraduate. I just have a quick question on how maybe national narrative can be fundamentally formed and reformed, and maybe this might go to Dr. Fine as well as you, Professor Nussbaum. I'm from Germany myself, and I didn't read what particularly you said about Germany, Professor Nussbaum, but my understanding growing up in Germany is also that, in a sense, Germany has many times over refashioned its political narrative quite radically. So, for example, after 1856, or not 1856, after the 1870s, when Germany became a nation again, the sort of localist narratives of Prussia and Bavaria, etc., were sort of put aside in favor of this greater nationalist narrative. And then after 1945, of course, we arrived at a current narrative, not so strong then, but brought out more in '68 with the student protests, and a narrative that very much favors non-national values almost in its patriotism. So, I think it's quite unique almost. You can also see it in Japan, but the sort of non-nationalist, very sort of humbled by our own history idea. And I was wondering whether maybe for Britain to overcome its colonial history, some sort of cathartic event is needed, and absent that, it won't be possible to change such deeply ingrained emotions. I'm not suggesting that Germany has found the way forward, but I was wondering what would it take to really
I'll let her answer that part, but the German one, let me just say that what I said was only that German people listening to me talk about this were nervous because they associate appeals to emotion with National Socialism. And I think there was a problem back then too, that the Weimar intellectuals didn't like appeals to symbolism and appeal to emotions, and then they realized too late that they ought to have done that on the other side, but then they lost out. It's rather like Nehru in India. So I think now, I think you're right, that Germany has done quite remarkably in retooling and rewriting its national narrative in order to confront the terrible traumatic events. So, but I'll let Sarah comment on Britain.
I don't know. I mean, hasn't Britain already been through lots of kind of cataclysmic events that probably should have been cathartic but weren't, like losing the empire? It's difficult to say because it's just such a strong part of the identification of so many people in this country, and there isn't a strong sense among a large number of those people that empire was ultimately something that Britain did wrong. And I don't know how that kind of sense is going to be fashioned, and so I don't know how that kind of narrative is going to triumph, but other people in the audience who are British might have interesting things to say about that themselves.
And there's also the narrative of racial and ethnic inclusion, which, it's a big struggle here, I must say. And I think one aspect of it that I notice, although London is quite different, but you go to most places in Britain and in the academy itself, you see only white faces, at least in the part that I'm in anyway, and you see no Muslim faces, and it's also true in the elite schools insofar as I've encountered them. So, I think there's a real, the fact that such a large proportion of British people now on this recent survey say that they're racially prejudiced has something to do with the lack of daily contact in a variety of occupations with people from different groups. But then also, of course, that's strongly encouraged by this stereotyping that the government is putting forward now in this citizenship test. Oh yeah, you'll see a Muslim in this occupation and serving you curry and so. And so I don't, I think that there are good things that could be done to address that, such as an emphasis on diversity as a value in itself in higher education and in the academy, and such as a very different portrayal of what it would be to be a citizen, where you don't have this stereotyping.
Okay, look, I'm conscious of the time now, so I think what we need to do is maybe collect 3 final questions. There's one here, and then there's a third question. Someone wanted to ask an open-ended general question, and I promised them they could ask that, so they could just identify themselves if they're still here. No, so if that's the case, then we'll just stick with the 2 there first.
Okay, thank you. Just first, just a quick comment on the current topic. Given that the nation state and citizenship, etc., the apparatus of citizenship, the flip side of that, of course, is statelessness. And it seems to me it's interesting to speculate on the idea of a kind of love of statelessness as being a condition of a kind of parallel to the nation state, or the notion of the nation as being a space of affect, if you like. But I have a more specific question that goes to something you mentioned really earlier about the examples of Anish Kapoor and the examples of the artworks in Chicago in particular. And what I'm interested in asking, I'm going to read this out because it's probably easier that way. Although it's kind of conventionally understood that visual art is a space of affect, and your examples of Kapoor, etc., although they draw on artwork situated in the formalist tradition, they describe you described citizens as being somehow reflected, i.e., critically or comically in this interaction with the work. But what I'm curious to know, if you could expand on or give me a bit more detail, in what sense do these experiences operate instrumentally in shaping or understanding oneself as a citizen, that is, as a political subject, and how is political affect formed in these experiences, specifically in these particular examples, which are derived from kind of this particular type of formalist art, and rather than as a moment of entertainment or exactly that. Yeah.
And one more question. Front, please.
Yes, it's a question on the power of thought. You just said that you have no power, but you are also one of the 100 most influential philosophers, I think, and a lot of people read your work, and think with your philosophy. So certainly you are influencing the way we think, and that we discuss. You bring up discussions like today, which is fantastic. So in your authorship, I'm often puzzled by what I find as a lack of the power aspects of things, of the power of thought, and how you look at it.
Okay, so Anish Kapoor, I think what you can only tell by how people use the work and the space, how they associate in the space. And it's important that what used to be the main park of Chicago, it's still there, although it's just no one goes there, was this pristine fountain and a formal garden, which was created explicitly to make Chicago seem elite like the capitals of Europe, and so Buckingham Fountain and so on. And it was made to give the signal that this is a lawn you can't walk on, and that poor people had better not go there, and you have to be very clean to go there, and so on. The popular book, The Devil in the White City, gives a very good history of that part of Chicago architecture. The Millennium Park had a different design and an aim to lure people in, to get them to associate with each other in a way that was pleasant and easy and not fraught with a sense of who's in and who's out and so on. And you see that contrary to all expectation, really, even of the best expectations, everyone is paddling around in the pool. It's not just kiddies, but it's their grandparents and black and white, Latino and so on. It's the only one of the few places in Chicago where all the races just paddle around in the pool together. So that's the Crown Fountain. But the Anish Kapoor piece, which I don't know how he conceived it initially. He may well have just thought, because he called it Cloudgate. No one calls it that. They call it the Bean. And they use it in a much more humorous and personal way than the way it could have. It could have just been reflecting the buildings and reflecting the sky and so on. And it does that, and it is important that it's beautiful. But the fact that people lie under it and they laugh at each other and they laugh at themselves and so on, I don't know whether that was predicted. So how does that affect their other dealings with each other? Well, it certainly makes it's very different from what was on offer before. That certainly one can say. And then the third piece is the Frank Gehry bandshell, which is again a modernist piece, but it's kind of like a military helmet that's turned over on the side with plumes sprouting out of it. So it's an emblem of peace, and people use that. Again, they go to concerts there of many different kinds, but they come in a very informal way. They eat their food there, they eat their picnic there. So they feel relaxed in the space, and they feel happy associating together in the space. And that's also true, by the way, with the Picasso on Daly Center Plaza, which people hated when it came in because it was modernist art. And so now, everyone climbs all over it and they think it's wonderful. And so I think being relaxed together in the space is a big part of what helps you see what's happening to citizenship, because, of course, in the old days, people of different classes were not relaxed together in the space. But that no time to say more. The power of thought, there's this organization called the Human Development and Capability Association, which some people here are members of. And young people who had studied with Amartya Sen and me came to us and said, well, you have these ideas, but they're not really getting implemented around the world. But what if there were an association that would promote both the further intellectual work on the ideas and a bridge between theory and practice, so development practitioners could come to the meetings and so on. And so now the association is about to have its 10th anniversary, and I think it's fair to say that the ideas are much more mainstreamed, much more implemented in different places in different ways, least of all in the United States. I don't think anyone mentions capabilities at all in the United States, but in many places it's a working part of, let's say, the Human Rights Commission of Australia. Works with these ideas every day. I was delighted to see, and so on. So, just it's all too plural to really have a sense of measuring it, but I think, I think it takes organization, and it takes this bridge between theory and practice, and bridges across nationalities, and of course across disciplines in the case of philosophy and economics. So there are, certainly I'm extraordinarily grateful to the people who helped to start that association, who are themselves, Sen and I are the so-called founding presidents, but the people who really did all the work are Sabina Al-Khair of Queen Elizabeth House, and Muzaffar Quiselbash of York University, Flavio Comim of who's now back in Brazil, and a number of other younger theorists.
Okay, thank you very much, Martha. I'd like to thank everyone for participating today, for the excellent discussion. I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd particularly like to thank Martha. Martha is a tremendous philosophical inspiration to many of us. She's also an exemplary role model as an intellectual, and many of us, and myself included, would simply not be able to recognize our philosophical trajectory without her input and influence. It's been a tremendous privilege and a pleasure to have her here. Thank you very much, Martha.